The last time I visited Roberta was at her mom's house. We were roasting marshmallows on her patio. Roberta lived in a small community in Chiapas, in Mexico, in between mountains, far away from the busy city life. It was a new moon, so the sky was pitch black. From her house, we could hear the noise of the river passing and of the crickets chirping. We both sat on a log and stared at the fire as she told me that she was about to move in with her boyfriend, with whom she had been together for almost 4 months. Being 20 years old, she felt like she was already late to start a family and to live with him. There were no opportunities to study or to work in her community. After this conversation, we didn't have much contact. Just some text messages where she assured me that she was well, but also mentioned that living as a couple was, in her words, sometimes difficult. The next time I saw Roberta was at the health clinic, when she came in for a pregnancy test. Immediately as I saw her, I ran towards her to hug my friend. But this time she seemed very different. The teenage girl that I once knew that enjoyed fashion and makeup and was very extroverted seemed to be gone. This time she spoke quietly, and she had black circles around her eyes, revealing her exhaustion. When we walked to the sheltered side of the clinic, Roberta broke into tears. She told me that she felt lonely and overworked, that her husband didn't allow her to play basketball, wear what she wanted to, or visit her family as often. She went from having many friends in her community to being all day home doing household chores. When she told her mother how she felt, her mom answered that this was something normal and that all women in the community have to go through the same experience. Roberta's situation made me think of the many stories that women have told me ever since I started living in rural Mexico. And although the stories of physical abuse are some of the hardest to hear, even when the violence isn't physical, as in Roberta's case, there is this striking pattern of isolation weaving all of these stories together. Most women do not trust others in their community to disclose how they feel. How could they, when there are limited spaces for them to connect with others outside of their families? They aren't considered in community leadership activities, and this idea that violence is normal is passed on from generation to generation. Instead of women being allies, they end up being competition. This results in women going through these experiences by themselves, and even feeling like they exaggerate if they complain. It is no surprise that there are higher rates of depression and anxiety in women in these communities. That day, sitting on dusty ground next to Roberta made me remember when I was her age. This was the age when I started reading my first books on feminism. And suddenly, there was a name for what I felt for when I was afraid to walk on the street by myself, or when I felt like an imposter in a room full of smart people. This was called sexism, and it was not all in my head. It also reminded me of how privileged I was when I was 20, being able to have options to choose the future that I wanted. The only difference between Roberta and me was the place and the family that I was born into. And this broke my heart because I knew that things could be different, and I knew that violence didn't have to be the norm. At Roberta's age, feminism made me feel embraced and supported when I realized that I was surrounded by networks of women that had been invisible to my eyes until that very moment. These webs connected women, but they didn't happen naturally. They required someone to be behind the scenes, shining light on them and connecting every thread, every experience. And I thought that maybe Roberta could have her own web, so she could liberate herself from this isolation. So I created the first web, and I got 4 community mental health workers together, named by themselves Cuidadoras de Salud Mental, which translates in mental health caregivers in English. And we started having a conversation about the greatest threat to the mental health of women in the region. And apparently I wasn't the only person that was worried about the violence that women experience daily. The cuidadoras felt the same way. And not only did the cuidadoras feel the same way, they interviewed women in the communities and they found a common pattern. They were all worried. So when we gathered all this information, we sat down to think and we thought, so now what? What do we do about this? I heard some of the cuidadoras say that this didn't have a solution. And I know this feeling because I have it all the time. I encounter such a massive structural problem. I know that it is difficult to know where to start from and not to lose hope in the process. My friends and me call this feeling the enormity, not just as a noun, but as a feeling as well. And it's this feeling when you feel so tiny to a problem that is so big. But if I've learned something, is that the best way to face the enormity is to start from what you can do, instead of looking at the things that you can't. So the cuidadoras and I started drawing a problem tree, where on every branch we wrote down the consequences that gender-based violence has on women's mental health. We noted that it makes them feel stressed, it makes them feel lonely, and makes them feel like their opinion doesn't matter. And then we walked to the back of the room and we looked at our tree and we saw all of these branches. And suddenly this problem didn't seem so big anymore. This seemed like something that we could actually work on. And once we sat down, we started brainstorming, and this was when the idea of creating women's circles was born. We knew that we couldn't stop the violence, but we could create spaces where women would feel relaxed, supported, and important, where they could view violence as a collective issue that required collective care, not just individual mental health care. And I can't say that it was easy implementing these circles. Imagine organizing group activities with the pandemic in a community where there is no cell phone service. Zoom groups were definitely not an option. But even with delays came the day when the cuidadoras would start inviting women to these circles. It was a clear and sunny day when one of the cuidadoras facilitated her first circle. We broke a sweat going from hill to hill, inviting women and reminding them to come. We were very nervous because there was another community activity the same day, and we thought that nobody would show up. And we started waiting for them, and suddenly 2 of them arrived, and then more and more arrived, leaving us without enough chairs for them to sit down. The cuidadora started the group confidently with a round of applause. And I feel overwhelmed when I think of all the powerful conversations that happened in just one space. Women started talking about how their self-esteem was affected when they felt invisible in community meetings, and how difficult it was for them to stand up and give their opinion. But this was precisely what was happening in that moment. They were standing up and they were saying what they thought. This meant that the groups were a safe space. I can still picture the moment when Gloria, one of the participants, said that she had so much work that she never had time to sit down and have a meal, and that until that day, she never really thought of housework as work because her husband didn't find it valuable. When I looked around and I saw all of the women nodding, I knew that she was not the only one. And lastly, I can still feel goosebumps when the women started sharing their experiences with domestic violence, and that this conversation ended in the conclusion that it was not their fault. There is still more to be done when it comes to violence against women. There needs to be structural and cultural changes that allow women to be financially independent and men to connect with their emotions. But we need to start from what we can do because it builds a foundation to create something bigger. The women's circles haven't reached the community where Roberta lives now, but I hope that they someday will. These circles are a web of sisterhood and resistance, intertwined with many other webs in other communities and other countries. What started as a small web of only 5 women has now grown to connect more than 60, more than 70 women. And the cuidadoras prove that solutions to complex problems lie within the communities. What I've learned from this fellowship is that sometimes there just needs to be a weaver, pulling on the thread of shared experiences, motivations, values, and creating a space where people can realize that they are not alone and that they are stronger together.